Tonight, I have 12 true stories from the early 1980s, a decade where the world's safety was often just a thin veil over absolute chaos. You will hear steady rain and soft white noise underneath these stories. So if you are listening late at night, just settling in, get comfortable. And if you enjoy strange, dark, and mysterious stories told slowly, subscribe and leave me a comment telling me where you are listening from tonight. And for the like button, maybe treat it like a stranger offering you a ride home after dark. Imagine they are pulling up in a car with tinted windows, offering a friendly smile that does not quite reach their eyes. Smile back politely, keep your distance, and just hit. Like instead of opening that door. All right, turn the lights down, get comfortable, listen to the rain, and let us ease into the first story of the night. On the morning of June 22nd, 1982, at the heavily fortified Perth Mint in Western Australia, a bank teller named Brian welcomed a man in a crisp uniform. The visitor moved with the confidence of a regular, placing a series of bank checks on the counter while discussing the heavy lifting required for the day. Brian checked the watermarks and signatures, finding nothing out of place. It felt like a transaction that would be forgotten by lunch. Brian had worked at the Mint for several years, becoming accustomed to the rhythm of high-value transactions and the weight of the vault doors. He lived a quiet life in the suburbs, usually spending his weekends gardening or taking his children to the beach. On this particular Monday, the air was crisp, and the office smelled of floor wax and old paper. He did not expect the day to be any different from the hundreds of shifts he had worked before. The man across the counter waited patiently while Brian verified the checks for a total of $653,000. This was a massive sum of money, but for the Perth Mint, it was just the cost of doing business in the bullion trade. Brian felt the heavy stock of the paper between his fingers, noting the official bank stamps that appeared entirely legitimate. He authorized the release of the metal and signaled for the security detail. Deep inside the vault, the couriers began the laborious task of moving 49 gold bars toward the waiting transport vehicle. Each bar weighed exactly 400 ounces, casting a soft, yellow glow under the fluorescent lights of the loading bay. The heavy thuds of metal hitting the floor of the truck echoed through the quiet morning air. Everything followed the strict protocol established by the Mint over many decades to ensure total security. The transport vehicle was an ordinary-looking truck, chosen specifically to blend in with the morning traffic of the city. As the last bar was secured, the driver gave a short nod to the security staff and climbed into the cab. Brian watched from the window as the taillights disappeared around the corner of Hay Street. He returned to his ledger, recorded the transaction, and moved on to the next customer waiting in the lobby area. It was a very routine morning. 3 days later, a phone call from the head office changed the temperature of the room in an instant. The bank checks had been processed through the clearinghouse and returned as complete fabrications. There was no account, no money, and certainly no authorization for the purchase of any bullion. The 49 bars of gold were already long gone, likely melted down or hidden in a location far from the reach of Western Australia. The bank was in a panic. Detectives from the CIB arrived within the hour, dusting the counters for fingerprints and interviewing every staff member who had touched the documents. They focused their attention on the logistics of the heist, noting that the perpetrators seemed to have an intimate knowledge of bank procedures. The search for a lead was frantic, as the loss of such a large amount of gold was a significant blow to the reputation of the state government. They needed a culprit. The investigation soon shifted toward 3 brothers living in the suburbs of Perth, named Ray, Peter, and Brian Mickelberg. The brothers were known for their interest in aviation and high-end mechanics, making them prime suspects for such a bold and technical operation. Ray was a former paratrooper with a strong personality, while his brothers were skilled tradesmen who spent their time building custom equipment in their backyard workshop. They were capable men. Before the arrest, the Mickelberg family lived a life centered around their work and their shared passion for flying. Ray was often seen at the local airfield, tinkering with his private plane and planning his next flight over the vast Australian outback. They were a tight-knit group, frequently gathering for Sunday dinners, where the conversation rarely veered away from engineering or local news. There was no outward sign of sudden or unearned wealth in their lives. One evening, while Ray was working on a specialized engine part in his garage, several unmarked police cars pulled into his driveway. Officers moved quickly, ordering him to put down his tools and step away from the workbench. They began a systematic search of the property, tearing through drawers and looking for any sign of the missing 49 gold bars. Ray watched in silence, confused by the sudden aggression of the men in suits who invaded his home. I noticed that during the entire search, the police never actually checked the one place where a mechanic would likely hide something heavy, which was inside the hollowed-out engine blocks scattered around the yard. They seemed more interested in the paperwork on the desk than the physical reality of the workshop. It is a strange detail that suggests they were looking for a specific kind of evidence rather than the gold itself. They moved with a very odd purpose. The detectives claimed they had found a set of gloves and a notebook that linked the brothers directly to the fake checks at the mint. They also seized a large quantity of gold beads from the property, which they alleged were remnants of the stolen bullion. Ray maintained that the beads were simply scrap from his legitimate work as a mechanic and jeweler. The officers ignored his explanations and transported all three brothers to the central station that night. Inside the interrogation room, the walls were painted a dull gray, and the only light came from a single fixture on the ceiling. Ray sat in a hard wooden chair, facing two detectives who spoke in low, rhythmic tones about the evidence they had gathered. They insisted that his brothers were already in separate rooms, providing detailed accounts of the heist that placed Ray at the center of the conspiracy. The pressure in the room was constant and heavy. You are sitting in a cramped interview room, watching a detective slide a piece of paper across the table that supposedly bears your signature. You know you never touched that document, but the officer is telling you that the evidence is irrefutable and your brothers are already confessing in the next room. The air feels heavy, and the exit seems miles away. You realize the system is no longer looking for the truth, but is only searching for a conviction. During the questioning, the police claimed they had found a set of fingerprints on the original fake checks that matched Ray Mickelberg perfectly. This was the smoking gun the prosecution needed to move forward with the case. Ray was stunned. As he knew he had never seen those checks before, the detectives showed them to him in the station. He realized that the narrative was being built around him regardless of what he said or what the actual facts were. The trial began in 1983, drawing massive crowds of spectators and journalists who were eager to see the men who had outsmarted the mint. The prosecution relied heavily on the fingerprint evidence and a series of typed confessions that the police claimed the brothers had signed voluntarily. The defense argued that the brothers had no motive and no means of disposing of the gold, but the technical evidence seemed overwhelming to the jury. Forensic experts took the stand, testifying with absolute certainty that the fingerprints on the documents were a scientific match. The jury listened intently to the descriptions of how the heist was planned and executed, according to the police theory. Despite the fact that not a single bar of the 49 gold bricks was ever found, the atmosphere in the courtroom turned sharply against the Mickelberg family as the weeks went on. They were seen as villains. When the verdict was read, a heavy silence fell over the room as the word guilty was repeated for each of the three brothers. Ray looked at his family in the gallery, his face a mask of disbelief as the judge handed down sentences of up to 20 years in prison. They were led away in handcuffs, becoming the faces of one of the most famous crimes in the history of the country. Their lives were effectively over, all based on a set of papers they never signed. The transition to maximum security prison was a brutal shock for men who had spent their lives in the open air and the workshop. Ray found himself surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, far from the airfield and the family he loved. He spent his days in the prison library, studying law books and forensic manuals in a desperate attempt to find a flaw in the case against him. He refused to accept his fate and worked through the night to find a single error. For nearly 20 years, the Mickelbergs fought their convictions from behind bars, filing appeal after appeal with the Supreme Court. Each time, they were met with a wall of legal resistance, as the authorities were unwilling to admit that the original investigation could have been flawed. The public interest in the case slowly began to fade, and the brothers became a footnote in the criminal history of Western Australia. They were almost forgotten by the public. I wonder if you have ever felt that the harder you push against a closed door, the more the people on the other side pretend they cannot hear the knocking. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from being right in a world that has already decided you are wrong. We often assume that the truth is a loud thing that eventually demands to be heard, but the Mickelbergs spent 2 decades learning that the truth can be very quiet in a prison cell. In the late 90s, Ray was finally released on parole, but his name remained tarnished by the conviction. He continued his private investigation, spending his own money to hire experts who could re-examine the fingerprint evidence from the trial. He believed that the only way to clear his name was to prove that the police had lied under oath. It was a long and lonely battle against a powerful institution that had no interest in reopening an old wound. In 2002, a retired police officer named Tony Lewandowski stepped forward with a heavy conscience and a shocking confession. He admitted that he and his partner had physically assaulted the brothers during the interrogation to force them into signing the statements. Furthermore, he revealed that they had taken Ray Mickelberg's fingerprints from a glass in the station and used a specialized kit to plant them on the evidence. It was all a lie. The entire foundation of the prosecution had been built on a deliberate and calculated lie. Lewandowski explained that the pressure to solve the heist was so great that the detectives felt they had no choice but to manufacture the results. The public was outraged, as the realization set in that 3 innocent men had spent the best years of their lives in prison for a crime they did not commit. The legal system was in a state of absolute crisis. I sometimes look at the old photographs of the Mickelberg brothers and wonder how many other stories are buried under the weight of a convenient lie. It is one thing to lose a fortune in gold, but it is another thing entirely to lose 20 years of your life to a shadow. The truth often waits until it is too late to make things right for those who were left behind in the dark. It is a heavy price to pay for a mistake that was never truly a mistake. In the long, cold shadow of 2026, the Perth vault is still missing its weight, and the mystery of where that gold finally landed remains a debt the city can never truly collect. The Mickelberg brothers have been officially exonerated by the state, but the 49 bars of gold have never been recovered. The mystery of who actually walked into the mint that morning remains a cold case in the files of the Western Australia Police to this day. The bullion is likely scattered across the globe in different forms, hidden in private collections or melted into jewelry that people wear without knowing its history. Some things, once lost, stay gone forever, regardless of how much truth is eventually brought to light. The brothers return to their workshops, but the time they lost can never be rebuilt like an engine or a plane. They live with the echo of those 20 years every single day. On the evening of November 9th, 1983, outside the brick headquarters of the Heineken brewery in Amsterdam, 50-year-old chauffeur Ab Doderer sat behind the wheel of a dark limousine. He watched the heavy glass doors, waiting for his employer to finish his final meeting of the day. The city air was damp with the smell of the canal and the faint, sweet scent of malt drifting from the nearby vats. Alfred Freddie Heineken was one of the wealthiest men in Europe, but he preferred the comfort of a set routine. He was a man who appreciated order, often spending his evenings at home with his family after a long day of global business decisions. To most of the world, he was a titan of industry, but to Ab, he was simply a passenger who enjoyed a quiet drive through the streets he had known since childhood. As Freddie stepped out onto the sidewalk, a white van suddenly swerved toward the curb, blocking the path of the limousine. Several men wearing balaclavas and brandishing submachine guns jumped from the sliding doors, moving with a calculated speed that suggested months of practice. Before Ab could reach for the ignition or the radio, he was pulled from the car and forced into the back of the van alongside a stunned and silent Freddie. The doors slammed shut, plunging the two men into a cold and lightless interior that smelled of diesel and wet wool. The van accelerated quickly, weaving through the narrow streets of Amsterdam while the captors remained perfectly silent, their weapons held steady. Freddie felt the vibration of the road beneath him, trying to count the turns in his head to maintain some sense of direction, but the complexity of the route soon overwhelmed his mental map. They arrived at a nondescript warehouse in the Western Docklands, where a specialized room had been constructed inside a series of shipping containers. The walls were lined with thick acoustic foam, designed to absorb every sound and prevent any cry for help from reaching the outside world. Freddie was pushed into a tiny, unheated cell containing nothing but a narrow cot and a chemical toilet. The heavy steel door clicked shut, leaving him in a vacuum of silence. For the next 3 weeks, Freddie's world was reduced to the 4 walls of his soundproofed box. He was given basic meals through a small slot in the door, never seeing the faces of the men who held his life in their hands. To keep his mind from fracturing, he began to follow a strict mental exercise routine, reciting the history of his company and planning future advertising campaigns. He treated the cell like an office, refusing to let the cold or the isolation break his spirit. Outside the warehouse, a courier delivered a package to the Heineken family containing a recorded message and a demand for 35 million guilders. This was the largest ransom request in history, a sum so massive it required the coordination of several international banks. The kidnappers communicated through coded messages in the personal columns of local newspapers, using the names of characters from popular children's stories to signal their instructions. Detective Gert van Beek led the task force assigned to track the money, setting up a secret command center in a hotel overlooking the drop-off points. They used the latest thermal imaging technology and directional microphones to monitor the kidnappers' movements, but the gang was disciplined and elusive. Every time the police thought they had a lead, the suspects would vanish into the crowded city streets, leaving behind nothing but empty phone booths and frustration. You are sitting on the edge of a thin mattress, listening to the absolute nothingness of a soundproof room. Every few hours, you hear a faint metallic scrape as a plastic tray is pushed through a slot, but no words are ever exchanged. You realize that your entire empire, your wealth, and your influence mean nothing in this cold, dark space. The only thing that matters is the rhythm of your own heart and the hope that your family is listening. The final exchange took place on a dark highway bridge, where the kidnappers demanded the money be thrown from a moving vehicle into a designated spot below. The police watched from a distance, hoping to catch the suspects in the act, but a sudden fog rolled in from the North Sea, obscuring their vision at the critical moment. The ransom, packed into 5 large bags, disappeared into the night, and for several days there was no word on the fate of the hostages. An anonymous tip finally directed the police to a warehouse located in the industrial outskirts of the city. When the tactical teams breached the building, they found a false wall hidden behind a stack of crates, leading to the soundproofed containers. They used circular saws to cut through the reinforced steel doors, finally revealing a pale and exhausted Freddie Heineken. He looked at the officers with a mixture of relief and professional curiosity, asking if they had brought any beer. The investigation into the kidnappers revealed a group of 5 local men, led by a charismatic criminal named Willem Holleder. They had spent over 2 years planning the operation, even going so far as to build a practice cell in a remote wooded area to test the soundproofing. They had lived ordinary lives in the neighborhood, appearing to their friends and family as small-time businessmen while they orchestrated the most daring crime in Dutch history. I noticed that even after his rescue, Freddie never sat with his back to a door again for the rest of his life. He spent a fortune on private security and armored cars, turning his own home into a version of the fortress his kidnappers had built for him. It is a strange thing to see a man buy back his freedom, only to spend the rest of his days living like a prisoner of his own fear. Now, in the sterile light of a high-security cell in 2026, the man who built a fortress for his victim finally realizes that he is the one who will never see the outside of a wall again. Willem Holleder remains in a maximum security prison in the Netherlands, serving a life sentence for his involvement in several other high-profile gangland murders. Most of the original 35 million guilders was recovered by the police, but several million disappeared and is believed to be buried in a forest or hidden in offshore accounts. The warehouse where Freddie was held was eventually demolished, but the story remains a dark cornerstone of Dutch folklore. While Heineken sat in a soundproof cell in Amsterdam, halfway across the world in Seattle, a different group of men was preparing a room for a far more permanent silence. On the night of February 18, 1983, 61-year-old Wai Chin walked through the rain toward a red door in the basement of the Louisa Hotel in Seattle. The International District was quiet, with the neon signs of King Street reflecting off the wet pavement. He pressed a small buzzer, and a heavy wooden panel slid back, revealing a pair of eyes that recognized him immediately. He stepped inside, shaking the water from his coat. Wai Chin had spent most of his life working long shifts in restaurant kitchens, his hands calloused from years of handling heavy woks and sharp knives. He lived a modest life in a small apartment nearby, saving what he could from his wages to support his family. His one indulgence was a night at the Wa Mi Club, where he could escape the heat of the kitchen. It was a place where he could speak his own language and enjoy the familiar clatter of tiles. The neighborhood around him was a bustling hub of activity during the day, filled with the sounds of street vendors and the smell of roasting ducks. But as the sun went down, the area took on a different character, one defined by the shadows of the alleyways and the quiet hum of the underground clubs. Wai Chin navigated these streets with the ease of a man who had walked them for decades. He felt a deep sense of belonging in this corner of the city. He usually started his evening with a simple meal at a local noodle shop, sitting by the window to watch the passers-by. He enjoyed the predictable rhythm of the evening, noting which of his neighbors were out and which shops were closing their shutters for the night. There was a comfort in the repetition, a feeling that as long as the lights stayed on and the tea stayed hot, the world was in its proper place. This night felt no different than any other. The walk to the Louisa Hotel was short, but the rain was persistent, soaking into his trousers and making the air feel heavy. He kept his head down, focusing on the rhythmic splash of his shoes against the concrete. When he reached the red door, he took a moment to straighten his collar and wipe his glasses. He looked forward to the warmth of the basement and the friendly competition of the games. He had no reason to believe that the door would soon become a trap. Inside the club, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the faint, sweet smell of jasmine tea. The Wa Mi was one of the oldest gambling dens in the city, a private sanctuary for the local community that had existed for over 60 years. There were no windows, and the sounds of the city above were muffled by layers of brick and soil. Wai Chin took his usual seat at a corner table, watching the dealer shuffle the dominoes with a rhythmic, mesmerizing precision. He exchanged a few words with the manager, a man he had known for a long time, about the rising cost of produce and the upcoming holiday celebrations. Around him, 13 other men were settled into their own games, their faces illuminated by the low-hanging lamps that cast long shadows across the green felt. It was a comfortable environment where everyone knew the rules and the stakes. Wai Chin felt a sense of ease as he placed his first modest bet of the evening. The other men in the room were mostly older, their faces etched with the lines of hard work and years of living in the district. Some were retired, while others were like Wai Chin, seeking a few hours of relaxation after a shift in a warehouse or a kitchen. They spoke in low tones, their conversations punctuated by the occasional laugh or the clack of tiles. There was an unspoken bond of trust in the room, as the club was a place where the outside world could be ignored. The basement was a labyrinth of small rooms and narrow hallways, each one serving a different purpose for the club's operations. The lighting was dim, designed to keep the atmosphere intimate and to prevent the glare of the lamps from reflecting off the gaming surfaces. Wai Chin appreciated the seclusion, feeling that he was in a place that the rest of the city had forgotten. He leaned back in his chair, sipping his tea and waiting for the next round of pai gow to begin. The peace was broken when 3 young men entered the club, their movements sharp and out of sync with the relaxed atmosphere of the room. They were not regulars, and they did not go to the cashier to exchange their money for chips. Instead, they moved to the center of the floor, drawing handguns from their jackets with a sudden, practiced efficiency. One of the men, whom Wai Chin recognized as a local troublemaker, named Willie Mack, ordered everyone to stay still. Willie Mack had a reputation for violence in the district, often associated with the small gangs that preyed on the local businesses. He moved with a nervous energy, his eyes darting around the room to ensure that no one was reaching for a phone or a weapon. His 2 accomplices followed his lead, fanning out to cover the exits in the cashier's booth. The men at the tables froze, their hands hovering over their tiles as the reality of the situation began to set in. You are lying face down on the cold floor, the smell of dust and old carpet filling your nose as you feel the rough texture of a nylon cord being tightened around your wrists. Your heart is hammering against your ribs, and the only sound in the room is the heavy breathing of the men around you and the metallic click of a weapon being readied. You realize that the door you entered so freely just an hour ago is now a barrier you might never be able to cross again. The gunmen moved from person to person, systematically emptying pockets and removing wallets while the victims remained bound and helpless on the floor. There was no shouting and no resistance, as the men in the club assumed this was a standard robbery that would end once the money was gone. They focused on the floor, avoiding eye contact with the attackers to show they were not a threat. Wai Chin felt the weight of a boot near his head as his own wallet was snatched. Once the looting was complete, The tone of the room changed from a robbery to something far more calculated and sinister. The three attackers moved to the far end of the room and huddled for a brief moment, their voices hushed as they made a final decision. They began to fire their weapons into the bound men on the floor, starting with the table nearest to the door. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a series of rapid, rhythmic pops that filled the air. Wai Chin felt a sharp, burning sensation in his neck and jaw before his world went completely black. The room was filled with the smell of burnt powder and the sound of shell casings hitting the floor. The gunmen worked with a cold-blooded efficiency, ensuring that every person in the room had been hit before they turned and walked out the door. They left the basement exactly as they had found it, except for the absolute silence that now hung over the gaming tables. Several hours later, the club was still and silent, the smoke having cleared to reveal a scene of absolute devastation. Wai Chin slowly regained consciousness, his body feeling heavy and unresponsive as he struggled to understand why he was still on the floor. He realized he was the only one moving in the entire room, as the men around him remained in the positions where they had fallen. The air was cold, and the only light came from a single lamp that was still swinging. With a monumental effort, Wai Chin managed to loosen his bindings, his fingers fumbling with the knots as his strength began to fade. He could feel the warmth of the liquid on his shirt, and every breath was a struggle against the pressure in his chest. He dragged himself toward the exit, his vision blurred and his mind focusing on a single goal. He reached the stairs and began the agonizing climb toward the red door, pulling himself up one step at a time with his elbows. He reached the street and collapsed against a parked car, where he was found by a passing security guard who initially thought he was a victim of a hit and run. The guard called for an ambulance, noting the severe wounds to the man's face and neck. When the first responders arrived, they were stunned by the amount of blood on the sidewalk and the frantic way Wai Chin was pointing back toward the basement of the hotel. He was unable to speak, but his eyes were wide. When the police entered the basement of the Louisa Hotel, they were met with a sight that would haunt their careers for years to come. They found 13 men who had been executed where they lay, still bound by the nylon cords that the killers had brought with them. The investigators moved carefully through the room, documenting the position of each body and the shell casings that were scattered across the floor. It was the deadliest mass murder in the history of Seattle. The crime scene was a chaotic mixture of discarded gambling tiles, overturned chairs, and the remnants of a night that had gone horribly wrong. Detectives noted that the cash register had been emptied, but the level of violence used was completely disproportionate to the amount of money stolen. They began the slow process of identifying the victims, many of whom were well-known figures in the community. The news of the massacre spread through the district like a wildfire. The coroner's office worked through the night, removing the bodies and conducting preliminary examinations to determine the cause of death. Each victim had been shot at close range, suggesting a level of coldness and calculation that was rare even in the most violent gang disputes. The investigators searched the alleyways and garbage cans for the murder weapons, but the killers had been thorough in their escape. The city was on edge, waiting for any news of a suspect. At the hospital, doctors worked to stabilize Wai Chin, who was the only person who could provide a clue as to what had happened inside the Wa Mi. He had survived a shot that should have been fatal, the bullet passing through his jaw and narrowly missing his spinal cord. As soon as he was conscious enough to communicate, a detective sat by his bed with a notepad. Wai Chin gestured for a pen and began to write down the names that would break the case wide open. Because Wai Chin had survived, the police did not have to wait for forensic evidence or a lucky break to identify the killers. He was able to provide the names of Willie Mack and Benjamin Aung, both of whom were known to the local authorities. The gunmen had not worn masks, as they had never intended for anyone in that room to live to tell the story. The realization that they had left a witness alive sent the killers into a panic as they tried to hide within the city. The manhunt was immediate and intense, with officers saturated in every corner of the district and the surrounding neighborhoods. Willie Mack and Benjamin Aung were captured within days, hiding in a local apartment while they planned their escape from the country. A third man, Tony Ng, managed to flee to Canada, where he remained a fugitive for years before finally being apprehended. The community watched as the men were led away in handcuffs, their faces showing no remorse. During the trial, the details of the gang's plan were revealed, showing that the massacre had been planned for weeks as a way to settle a debt and establish dominance in the area. The The prosecution used the testimony of Wai Chin to paint a picture of the absolute cruelty and indifference of the three young men. The jury listened to the descriptions of the final moments of the 13 victims, and the defense's attempts to humanize the killers fell on deaf ears. Willie Mack was the primary architect of the plan, a man who viewed the elders of the community as nothing more than obstacles to his own rise in the criminal underworld. He had calculated the risks and decided that the reward of the gambling money was worth the lives of 14 people. His arrogance was his downfall, as he believed his own myth of being untouchable. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fate shared by his two young accomplices. The survivors of the victims' families were left to pick up the pieces of their lives, their trust in the safety of their community shattered by the events of that night. The Wah Mee Club was closed permanently, the red door locked, and the basement left to gather dust. For decades, the story of the massacre was told in hushed tones, a reminder of the darkness that could exist just beneath the surface of a quiet street. The neighborhood slowly changed, but the memory remained. I often think about the way a single survivor can become the living record of a moment that was designed to be forgotten in the dark. It is a heavy burden to be the only voice left when 13 others have been silenced, carrying a truth that the killers thought they had buried under the floorboards. The survival of Wai Chin was the one variable the gunmen failed to account for in their perfect, cold-blooded plan. It is a reminder that the truth has a way of coming home. By the time the rain hits the pavement of the International District in 2026, the silence in that sealed basement has become a permanent resident, holding on to secrets that even the renovation of the floors above couldn't wash away. The site of the Wah Mee Club remains a sealed and silent part of the Louisa Hotel, which has since been renovated into modern apartments. The basement is no longer accessible to the public, but those who live there are well aware of the history beneath their feet. Willie Mack died in prison several years ago, while Tony Ng was eventually deported and remains under supervision. The case is still cited as the darkest night in the history of the city. On the evening of September 3, 1982, 31-year-old Emanuela Seti Carraro sat in the driver's seat of her small white Autobianchi A112. She was navigating the dense, humid traffic of Palermo, Italy, with her husband, General Carlo Alberto Dalla Chiesa, resting in the passenger seat. The sun was beginning to dip below the Mediterranean horizon, casting long orange shadows across the ancient stone buildings of the city. Emanuela had been married to the general for only 54 days, a brief period of domestic calm in a life otherwise defined by high-stakes conflict. She was a trained nurse, a woman who valued order and the quiet service of others. Her move to Sicily had been a leap of faith, joining a man who had spent his career dismantling the most dangerous insurgent groups in the country. She drove with a steady hand, focusing on the road ahead of them. The general was 61 years old, a man whose face was a map of the many battles he had fought against the Red Brigades in the north. He had recently been appointed the prefect of Palermo, a role created specifically to break the power of the Cosa Nostra. Despite his rank, he sat quietly in the small car, his uniform cap resting on his lap. He had traded his armored government vehicles for this modest car to enjoy a rare moment of privacy. They were heading toward a small restaurant on the coast for a late dinner, a simple plan that felt like a luxury in a city where every movement was monitored. Emanuela checked her rearview mirror occasionally, noting the sea of Vespas and small cars that crowded the narrow streets. The air coming through the windows was thick with the scent of jasmine and exhaust. It was a normal Friday evening in a city that had seen too much violence. The general had been complaining to his superiors in Rome that he felt isolated, lacking the legal powers and the personnel he had been promised. He was a man of action who found himself trapped in a web of bureaucracy and polite deflections. He knew the history of the island, and he knew that silence was often a precursor to a strike. He watched the pedestrians on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning for anything that felt out of place. Their route took them down the Via Carini, a street lined with tall apartment buildings that provided a perfect vantage point for anyone watching from above. Emanuela slowed the car as they approached a narrow section of the road, the tires humming against the smooth asphalt. The general reached over and patted her hand, a small gesture of affection that was uncharacteristic for a man of his military discipline. The evening was settling in. A tan BMW suddenly pulled out from a side street, accelerating quickly until it was positioned directly behind their small white car. At the same time, a high-powered motorcycle carrying two men in dark helmets drew level with the driver's side window. The coordination was precise, the result of weeks of surveillance and planning. The traffic around them seemed to melt away, leaving the Autobianchi isolated in the center of the lane. The men on the motorcycle and in the BMW produced Soviet-made AK-47 assault rifles, weapons that were far more powerful than anything used by local street criminals. They did not hesitate or offer a warning, as their objective was the total elimination of the targets inside the car. The first burst of fire hit the rear window, sending a spray of safety glass across the interior. The sound of the gunfire echoed sharply against the stone walls. Emanuela instinctively tried to steer the car toward the sidewalk, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel as she sought any form of cover. The motorcycle kept pace with her, the shooter firing a continuous stream of bullets through the thin metal of the door. The small engine of the Autobianchi revved high before the car hopped the curb and came to a sudden, jarring halt against a heavy wooden gate. The silence returned instantly. You are gripping the steering wheel of a small car, trying to navigate a narrow street when a motorcycle pulls alongside your window. You see the long, dark barrel of a rifle emerge from under a jacket and realize there is no escape in this confined space. The air suddenly fills with the smell of exhaust and the sound of shattering glass as the world outside becomes a blur of motion. You have only seconds to realize the trap has closed. The hit squad did not flee immediately. Instead, they stepped out of their vehicles to ensure that no one inside the Autobianchi was left alive. They fired several more rounds into the roof and the side panels, their movements calm and methodical. They were professionals working for the Corleonesi clan, acting on orders from the highest levels of the mafia hierarchy. Once satisfied, they climbed back into their vehicles and vanished into the city. The local police arrived within minutes, finding the white car riddled with over 30 bullet holes. They found the general slumped toward his wife, his hands still resting near hers in a final, protective stance. The investigators noted that there was no security detail following the prefect, a shocking lapse in protection for the most targeted man in Italy. The scene was documented with a grim realization that the mafia had declared open war on the state. The investigation revealed that the killers had been tipped off about the general's dinner plans by someone within the regional government. Every move he made had been recorded and reported to the boss of bosses, Salvatore Toto Riina. The hit was a message to Rome that Sicily belonged to the clans, and no officer, regardless of his fame or rank, was untouchable. The sheer brazenness of the attack stunned the entire nation of Italy. In the days following the funeral, a large banner was hung near the site of the ambush that read, "Here dies the hope of the honest citizens of Palermo." The public outcry was so intense that the government was forced to take immediate action. Within 10 days, they passed the Rognoni La Torre law, which for the first time made it a specific crime to belong to a mafia organization. It also allowed the state to seize the assets of known criminals. The law was a direct result of the general's death, providing the very tools he had begged for while he was still alive. It changed the landscape of Italian justice, allowing future prosecutors to dismantle the financial empires of the families. The investigators also discovered that the general's private safe had been emptied of several sensitive documents before the police could secure it. These files reportedly contained the names of high-level politicians. I often find that the bravest individuals are those who know exactly how the story ends, but choose to walk toward the finish line anyway. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a man who has been left to fight a war on his own. It is the sound of a system waiting for a reason to change. The general provided that reason at the highest possible cost to himself and the woman sitting beside him. He left behind a legacy that eventually broke the code. Looking back from the vantage point of 2026, the general's white car is gone, but the laws written in his blood have become the only shield keeping the shadow of the clans from swallowing the state whole. The legacy of General Dalla Chiesa is honored every year in Palermo, and the laws sparked by his death remain the backbone of the Italian anti-mafia strategy. Most of the men involved in the hit, including Toto Riina and Bernardo Provenzano, died in maximum security prison cells. The white Autobianchi is preserved in a museum as a reminder of the night the state finally decided to stop looking the other way. On the afternoon of May 30th, 1984, 58-year-old Manuel Buendía stepped out of his office in the heart of Mexico City. He adjusted his suit jacket, feeling the slight weight of the pistol he always carried in his waistband. The city air was thick with the gray haze of smog and the relentless noise of thousands of cars honking in the distance. He began the short walk toward the parking lot where his vehicle was waiting. Buendía was the most influential investigative journalist in the country, a man whose daily column, Private Network, was required reading for the political elite. He spent his mornings in a small, cluttered office filled with the smell of strong coffee and the metallic scent of typewriter ribbon. He lived a disciplined life, governed by the belief that the truth was the only weapon capable of cutting through the deep corruption of the state. His routine was as predictable as the ticking of a clock, a necessity for a man who received death threats on a weekly basis. He would arrive at his desk before the sun was fully up, sifting through a mountain of documents sent to him by anonymous sources. He enjoyed the quiet of the early hours, finding a sense of peace in the organized chaos of his files. To his colleagues, he was a pillar of integrity who never backed down from a story. He lived in a modest home with his family, where the conversation around the dinner table rarely touched on the dangerous topics he covered in his column. He was a devoted father who made sure to keep his professional life separate from his private world, creating a barrier of normalcy for his children. He enjoyed the simple pleasure of a well-cooked meal and the sound of his grandchildren playing in the garden during his rare weekend breaks. His office was a fortress of information, containing rows of filing cabinets that held the secrets of generals, politicians, and the rising leaders of the drug cartels. Buendía was meticulous, cross-referencing every tip and verifying every lead before it ever made it to print. He knew that a single mistake could be fatal, not just for his career, but for his life. He navigated the treacherous landscape of Mexican politics with a calm and steady hand. Every morning, he would walk to the local newsstand to buy copies of all the major newspapers, checking to see how the other outlets were covering the stories he had broken. He enjoyed the tactile feel of the newsprint and the way the ink would smudge on his fingers. This simple act was a connection to the world he served, a reminder that his words had a tangible impact on the people of Mexico. He was a man who truly loved his craft. He had a close circle of friends, mostly other journalists and human rights lawyers, who shared his vision for a more transparent government. They would meet at a quiet cafe near the Alameda Central, sharing information and warning each other about the latest movements within the security forces. These meetings were his lifeline, a way to stay grounded in a world where shadows often dictated the rules of the game. He trusted them with his life. On this particular Wednesday, the humidity was high, and the pavement radiated a dull heat that seemed to seep through the soles of his shoes. He had spent the afternoon working on a series of articles about the DFS, the federal security agency that operated with total impunity. He felt a sense of urgency in his work, as his recent findings suggested a deep and terrifying link between the government and the traffickers in the state of Veracruz. He exited the building onto the Avenida de los Insurgentes, walking with a brisk, purposeful stride that reflected his military background. He kept his eyes moving, scanning the faces of the people passing him on the sidewalk. He noticed a young man leaning against a lamppost, but the man seemed focused on a newspaper. Buendía continued toward the narrow alleyway that led to his parking space, his keys already in his hand for a quick departure. A tall man wearing a dark motorcycle jacket and a helmet with a tinted visor suddenly emerged from the shadows of a doorway. He moved with a practiced athleticism, cutting across the sidewalk to intercept Buendía from behind. Before the journalist could turn or reach for his own weapon, the man produced a 9mm handgun and fired 5 shots into Buendía's back at point-blank range. The sound of the gunfire was muffled by the roar of traffic. You are walking through a crowded city street, just minutes away from the safety of your car, when you feel a sudden presence closing in behind you. Your hand moves toward your pocket, but the world suddenly fractures into a series of sharp, rhythmic shocks that steal the breath from your lungs. You try to turn, to see the face of the person who has finally caught up to you, but the ground rises to meet you as the sounds of the city fade into a dull hum. The assassin did not run. He walked calmly toward a waiting motorcycle driven by an accomplice, and the two men vanished into the sea of vehicles on the main road. Buendía lay on the asphalt, his blood pooling around the very keys he had intended to use for his escape. Passers-by froze in shock, the realization of what had happened slowly rippling through the crowd. The most powerful voice in Mexican journalism had been silenced in broad daylight. The investigation was immediately taken over by the DFS, the very agency that Buendía had been investigating at the time of his death. The director of the DFS, José Antonio Zorrilla, arrived at the scene within minutes, personally overseeing the collection of evidence. He spoke to the press with a mask of grim determination, promising that the government would leave no stone unturned in the search for the killers of such a distinguished citizen. While the police were cordoning off the street, a separate team of DFS agents entered Buendía's private office and removed several boxes of his most sensitive files. They worked quickly, ignoring the protests of his assistants and the other journalists in the building. By the time the sun had set, the paper trail that Buendía had spent years building was gone, likely shredded or burned in a secure facility far from the eyes of the public. For weeks, the headlines were dominated by the murder, with various political figures expressing their outrage and demanding a swift resolution to the case. However, the official investigation seemed to go in circles, focusing on obscure international leads and ignoring the eyewitness reports from the scene. The detectives assigned to the case were frequently replaced, and the initial evidence was handled in a way that made it impossible to verify. The press corps in Mexico City began to realize that the investigation was a performance designed to obscure the truth rather than reveal it. They noted that Zorrilla had been one of Buendía's closest contacts within the government, making his sudden role as the lead investigator both convenient and highly suspicious. A cloud of fear settled over the local newsrooms, as other journalists realized that even a man as prominent as Buendía was not safe. Behind the scenes, the DFS was using the murder as an excuse to crack down on other dissident voices, claiming they were looking for conspirators. They conducted raids on the homes of student activists and union leaders, diverting public attention away from the actual events on the Avenida de los Insurgentes. The narrative was being tightly controlled by the same men who had been the subject of Buendía's final, unreleased investigation. The years passed, and the case of Manuel Buendía slowly faded from the front pages, becoming a symbol of the impunity that governed the country. His family continued to press for answers, but they were met with a wall of silence and bureaucratic delays at every turn. It appeared that the secrets he had died to protect would remain buried forever. The system had successfully absorbed the shock of his death and moved on to its next priority. Everything changed in the late 80s when a new administration took power and began a purge of the most corrupt elements within the security services. A specialized task force was established to look into the cold cases from the previous decade, focusing on the involvement of the DFS in political assassinations. They began by interviewing the lower-level agents who had been present at the scene of the crime, offering them immunity in exchange for the truth. They discovered that the assassin was a man named Rafael Moro Avila, a specialized agent within the DFS who had been trained in clandestine operations. He admitted that the hit had been planned for weeks and that the motorcycle used in the escape belonged to the agency's own motor pool. Most importantly, he stated that the order for the assassination had been given directly by José Antonio Zorrilla during a meeting in his private office. The task force eventually uncovered the motive behind the killing, which was far more complex than a simple political disagreement. Buendía had obtained evidence that Zorrilla was not only working for the drug cartels, but was also facilitating the transport of weapons for the CIA through Mexican territory. He was the bridge between the world of international intelligence and the rising power of the narcos, and Buendía was the only man who could prove it. Zorrilla had realized that his entire empire would collapse if Buendía published his findings, so he decided to use the resources of the state to eliminate the problem. He had calculated that his position as the head of the secret police would protect him from any consequences. He was so confident in his immunity that he had personally attended the journalist's funeral, even offering words of comfort to the grieving family in front of the cameras. The arrest of José Antonio Zorrilla sent shockwaves through the political establishment, as it was the first time a man of his rank had been held accountable for such a high-profile crime. He was captured while trying to flee the country, his luggage filled with cash and sensitive documents that linked him to other unsolved murders. The mask of the honorable public servant was finally stripped away, revealing the cold-blooded operative underneath. During the trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the testimony of former agents and the logs of the DFS motor pool. They showed how the agency had been used as a private hit squad for the director's personal and criminal interests. Zorilla sat in the dock with a defiant expression, refusing to admit to any wrongdoing even as his own subordinates testified against him. He was a man who believed he was still above the law. I have often felt that the ultimate irony of power is how easily it can pretend to mourn the very things it has destroyed with its own hands. It takes a specific kind of coldness to stand over a body and pledge justice while you are still holding the keys to the room where the truth is hidden. Buendía knew the risks of his profession, but he likely never imagined that his own protector would be the one to ensure he never finished his final story. The sentencing of Zorilla provided some measure of closure for the Buendía family, but it could not replace the loss of a man who had been the conscience of a nation. The case served as a stark reminder of the rot that can exist within the very institutions designed to provide security and justice. It opened the door for a wider discussion about the relationship between the government and the criminal underworld, a conversation that continues today. As the declassified files finally breathe the air of 2026, the name of the man who walked to his car that afternoon has become a ghost that still haunts the very agency that tried to bury his words. The declassification of Mexican intelligence files has confirmed that Buendía was killed because he had discovered the links between the DFS, the CIA, and the early Guadalajara cartel. José Antonio Zorilla was eventually convicted of the murder and spent over 2 decades in prison before being released under house arrest due to his failing health. The office where Buendía once wrote his columns is gone, but his name remains a symbol of the price of the truth. The memory of the afternoon in May remains etched in the history of the city, a moment when the lights were briefly turned off on the truth. Every year on the anniversary of his death, journalists gather at the site to remember his work and the courage it took to write those final lines. The alleyway has been paved over, and the buildings have changed, but the echo of the gunfire still lingers for those who know the history of the Avenida. On the morning of December 21st, 1982, at the Air France ticketing office in downtown Stockholm, 24-year-old clerk Ingrid Larsson was organizing a stack of flight manifests. The room smelled of fresh coffee and the faint chemical scent of stationery. She adjusted the hem of her blue uniform and looked toward the large glass windows, watching the light snowfall settle on the cobblestones. It was a Tuesday, and the rush was beginning. Ingrid lived in a quiet apartment in the Södermalm district, spending her evenings reading or visiting local art galleries with her friends. She had worked for the airline for 2 years, finding a sense of pride in helping travelers navigate their way across the globe. Her life was characterized by the safety and predictability of Swedish society, where the conflicts of the outside world felt like distant echoes from another planet. She was content with her routine. The office was a sleek, modern space located on the corner of a busy intersection, serving as a hub for international travel and commerce. Ingrid enjoyed the rhythm of her morning routine, which began with a polite greeting to the security guard and a walk through the lobby to her desk. She took a sip of her coffee and opened the first folder of the day, ready to process tickets for the afternoon flight to Paris. The heaters hummed softly against the winter chill. Stockholm, in the early 80s, felt like a sanctuary, a place where the concept of a violent political attack was almost entirely foreign to the public. People walked the streets with a sense of ease, and the large windows of the Air France office were meant to invite the world in rather than keep it out. Ingrid liked the way the city looked under a fresh layer of snow, feeling that she was part of a stable and protected community. The world seemed perfectly still. At 9:20, the doorbell chimed as a customer entered the lobby, shaking the snow from his wool coat before approaching the counter. Ingrid smiled and began the process of checking his reservation, her fingers moving quickly over the keys of her typewriter. She enjoyed the small interactions with the public, viewing each traveler as a story waiting to happen. The atmosphere was professional and calm, with the quiet hum of the city serving as a backdrop to her work. Around 9:30, a man carrying a heavy leather suitcase entered the lobby and walked toward the center of the room. He did not approach the ticket counters or ask for assistance, which Ingrid found slightly unusual for that time of day. He placed the bag down near a structural pillar and checked his watch with a quick, nervous motion. Before she could call out to ask if he needed help, the man turned and walked back out through the heavy revolving doors. Ingrid watched the suitcase for a moment, expecting the owner to return after realizing he had forgotten it on the floor. It was a well-worn piece of luggage, sitting alone in the middle of the polished marble floor like a misplaced object. She mentioned the bag to a colleague, who suggested it might belong to a passenger who had stepped out for a cigarette. The office continued to buzz with the sound of ringing telephones and the chatter of customers arriving. The bag sat undisturbed for several minutes, a dark shape against the light-colored stone of the lobby. Ingrid occasionally glanced at it, wondering if she should call security, but the busy nature of the morning kept her focused on her tasks. She was currently handling a complicated multi-city booking for a family of 4, and the details required her full attention. The presence of the suitcase became a background detail in the busy office environment. You are standing in the middle of a familiar street, looking at the place where you work, but the windows are gone and the air smells like a fire you cannot see. You realize that the borders of your country are no longer a shield against the anger of a world you only read about in the papers. The snow continues to fall, covering the glass on the ground, but you know that the feeling of being safe has disappeared as quickly as the man with the leather suitcase. The silence of the morning was shattered by a sudden, violent expansion of air that felt like a physical blow to Ingrid's chest. The large display windows disintegrated into millions of tiny fragments, falling onto the sidewalk like a curtain of diamonds. A thick cloud of gray dust and the smell of sulfur filled the room, obscuring the ceiling and the desks. Ingrid found herself on the floor, her ears ringing with a tone that blocked out the screams of the people. She managed to stand up, her vision blurred and her hands shaking as she touched the edge of her desk for support. The office she had known just seconds ago was now a landscape of twisted metal, shattered glass, and scattered paper manifests. She looked toward the street, seeing the white snow stained with debris and the silhouettes of people running away from the building. The air was cold, rushing into the room through the empty spaces where the glass had been. The explosion had been powerful enough to buckle the interior walls and bring down sections of the acoustic ceiling tiles. Ingrid looked at her hands, which were covered in a fine layer of white dust, and realized she was miraculously unhurt. Around her, other staff members were beginning to emerge from behind their desks, their faces masks of shock and disbelief. The primary sound in the room was now the distant wail of sirens and the crunch of footsteps on glass. The Swedish police and emergency services arrived within minutes, cordoning off the area and treating the injured on the sidewalk. This was a country that had not experienced a major terrorist attack in years, and the atmosphere was one of profound shock. The blast had been felt blocks away, rattling the windows of government buildings and causing a panic in the nearby shopping district. For the people of Stockholm, the event was a sudden intrusion of a global conflict into their peaceful lives. The police began a systematic search of the surrounding streets, looking for the man Ingrid had described. They found a discarded jacket in a nearby alley, but the suspect had already vanished into the morning crowd. Forensic teams spent the afternoon sifted through the debris, carefully collecting fragments of the suitcase and the clock mechanism used to trigger the device. They determined that the bomb was made of high-grade plastic explosives, a material not easily obtained by common criminals. The precision of the device suggested that the attack was the work of a professional organization with access to military resources. The investigation was now a matter of national security. The investigation led the authorities to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, where they found evidence of a sophisticated international network. They discovered documents linking the bombing to a pro-Palestinian militant group with ties to the notorious operative known as Carlos the Jackal. The target was chosen not for its military value, but because it represented French interests in a neutral territory. The illusion of Swedish safety was officially over. The detectives discovered that the cell had been operating in Stockholm for several months, using the city's open society to plan their logistics without detection. They had monitored the Air France office for weeks, noting the lack of security and the predictable patterns of the staff. The attackers had exploited the very trust that defined Swedish life, turning a public space into a battlefield. The realization was a bitter pill for the local authorities to swallow. Sometimes we think the walls of our homes are thick enough to keep the wind out, but we forget that the wind does not need a door to get inside when the house itself is built on shifting sand. You and I might watch the news and feel a sense of distance, yet for the people in that office, the distance disappeared in the time it took for a man to set a watch. We are often much closer to the edge of the world than we would ever like to believe in the dark. The bombing of the Air France office was followed by several other attacks across Europe, all linked to the same demand for the release of prisoners held in French jails. The Swedish government was forced to completely overhaul its security protocols, marking the end of the era of open diplomacy. The event changed the way the nation viewed international travel and the presence of foreign political conflicts within its borders. It was a permanent loss of innocence. In the quiet, modern safety of 2026, the agency born from that smoke continues to watch the suitcases in the lobby, knowing that the era of Swedish innocence was a luxury they could never afford to buy back. The site of the Air France office has been repurposed, and there is no physical marker of the explosion that occurred over 40 years ago. Most of the suspects linked to the bombing were never brought to justice, as they vanished into the complex web of Middle Eastern politics. The case remains a significant chapter in the history of the Seppo, marking the moment their mission changed forever to protect a country that was no longer isolated. The Stockholm blast was a warning that the old rules of neutrality no longer applied to the modern era of international conflict. It was a cold realization that safety was a luxury that could be withdrawn at any moment by a stranger with a suitcase. This sense of unease would soon cross the border into France, where an attack in the heart of Paris would reveal a secret that the government would try to bury for over 30 years to avoid a public scandal. On the afternoon of August 9, 1982, in the heart of the Jewish quarter in Paris, 42-year-old local merchant Mark opened the glass door to the Chiesa Goldenberg restaurant. He took a small table near the window, nodding to the waiter who already knew his regular order of corned beef. The air smelled of freshly baked rye bread and spiced meats, a familiar comfort in the historic district. The lunch hour was busy, but the atmosphere remained warm and slow. Mark had lived in the Maurice district his entire life, walking these cobblestone streets long before they became a fashionable destination for tourists. He was a man of simple habits, running a small shop nearby that specialized in antique clocks and fine mechanical repairs. He enjoyed the predictable rhythm of his Mondays, where the only challenge was deciding which book to read while he ate his meal. He sat back and watched the crowd outside the glass. The restaurant was a local institution, its walls covered in photographs and certificates that spanned several decades of history. It was a place where people from all walks of life gathered to share a meal and discuss the politics of the day in hushed, respectful tones. Mark felt a deep sense of security within these walls, believing that the traditions of his neighborhood were a shield against the rising tensions of the outside world. He was a man at peace. He had spent his morning carefully cleaning the gears of a 19th century pocket watch, a task that required absolute focus and a steady hand. This attention to detail followed him into his private life, where he appreciated the subtle nuances of a well-prepared dish or the way the light hit the ancient stone buildings across the street. He was a quiet observer, someone who found meaning in the small, consistent details of his environment. He felt lucky to be there. The neighborhood was filled with the sounds of children playing in the courtyards and the distant clatter of delivery trucks navigating the narrow alleys. Mark often thought about the history of the Rue des Rosiers, a street that had witnessed both the heights of community joy and the depths of historical sorrow. He felt that by maintaining his shop and his daily routine, he was contributing to the continuity of the district. It was a modest life, but it was his own. On this particular Monday, the sun was bright, and a light breeze carried the scent of summer flowers from the nearby parks. Mark noticed a young couple at the table next to him, their faces illuminated by the joy of a new relationship as they shared a plate of pastries. He smiled to himself, remembering his own youth in these same streets. He took a slow sip of his water and adjusted his napkins, waiting for the waiter to bring the main course of his lunch. He noticed a group of 4 men standing on the sidewalk just outside the window, their dark jackets appearing slightly out of place in the summer heat. They were not looking at the menu or the architecture, but were instead scanning the interior of the restaurant with a level of intensity that felt jarring. Mark watched them for a second, wondering if they were lost or looking for a friend. He dismissed the thought as the waiter finally arrived with his steaming plate. The men moved with a sudden, coordinated speed that shattered the peaceful atmosphere of the dining room in an instant. They did not enter through the door like customers. Instead, they fanned out across the front of the restaurant, drawing submachine guns and grenades from beneath their heavy coats. The sunlight reflected off the dark barrels of the weapons, as the first grenade was thrown through the glass, landing near the center of the crowded dining area. The explosion was a sudden wall of heat and pressure that threw Mark backward in his chair, his world dissolving into a haze of gray smoke and the sound of breaking china. Before he could process the shock, the air was filled with the rapid, rhythmic cracks of automatic gunfire. The shooters were not looking for specific targets. They were firing into the crowd with a cold, systematic indifference that suggested they were there to leave no one standing. You are sitting at a table with your lunch in front of you, when the window in front of your face simply disappears in a flash of white light. Your ears are ringing so loudly that the world seems to be moving in total silence, and you can see the muzzle flashes of the rifles like strobe lights in the smoke. You realize that your life is now measured in the seconds it takes for a man to change a magazine. The exit is just 10 feet away, but it feels like miles. The gunman entered the restaurant, stepping over the debris and the fallen diners to reach the back of the room. They worked in pairs, one covering the door while the other continued to fire into the kitchen and the storage areas where people had tried to hide. The sound was a continuous roar that blocked out all other noise, a mechanical storm that tore through the furniture and the walls. The attackers remained focused and silent as they completed their task. Once their ammunition was nearly spent, the four men turned and walked back out onto the Rue des Rosiers, firing several more bursts into the crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk. They vanished into the labyrinth of side streets before the first police sirens could be heard in the distance. They left behind a scene of absolute devastation, with 6 people dead and 22 others seriously wounded. The heart of the district had been torn open in broad daylight. French investigators arrived at the scene with a sense of urgency that bordered on desperation, as this was one of the most brazen attacks in the history of the capital. They found over 70 shell casings scattered across the floor of the restaurant, all from a specific type of Polish-made submachine gun, often used by extremist groups. The ballistics suggested a high level of training and a complete lack of hesitation on the part of the 4 men in dark jackets. The initial investigation focused on the Abu Nidal organization, a militant group known for its extreme violence and its opposition to any form of peace in the Middle East. Intelligence reports suggested that the group had established a cell in Europe months prior to the attack, but the suspects had been elusive. The police conducted hundreds of interviews, but the trail went cold almost immediately as the attackers had likely crossed the border within hours. For years, the families of the victims waited for justice, believing that the French government was doing everything in its power to find the men responsible for the massacre. However, the files on the case remained classified, and the lead investigators were frequently reassigned to other departments without explanation. A strange silence settled over the Rue des Rosiers, as if the state was trying to move on from a chapter it could not explain or resolve. The survivors noticed that every time a lead appeared to point toward a specific country or organization, the investigation would suddenly stall. There were rumors of political interference at the highest levels, but no one could provide a definitive answer as to why the case was being treated with such secrecy. Mark, who had survived the blast with minor injuries, spent decades asking questions that the authorities seemed determined to ignore or bury in paperwork. I think there is a specific kind of betrayal that happens when the people who are supposed to protect you decide that your life is less important than a quiet political arrangement. It turns the entire idea of justice into a ghost story, something you can see but never quite touch. We often assume that the truth is the ultimate goal of the law, but sometimes the law is just a way to manage the silence until everyone involved has finally walked away. In 2010, a series of leaked documents and declassified memos revealed a shocking secret that the French government had hidden for 30 years. It became known as the intelligence deal. Reports indicated that French intelligence officials had met with representatives of the Abu Nidal organization in the months following the bombing. They had reached a secret agreement that shocked the nation and the international community when it finally came to light. The terms of the deal were simple and cold. France would allow the members of the organization to move freely through the country and would not pursue the suspects in the Rue des Rosiers attack. In exchange, the Abu Nidal organization promised that they would never carry out another act of terrorism on French soil. The government had essentially traded the lives of the 6 victims for a guarantee of future domestic peace, leaving the killers to walk free. This revelation confirmed the worst fears of the survivors and the families, proving that the investigation had been a sham from the very beginning. The state had known the identities of the killers and where they were hiding, but had chosen to protect them to avoid further conflict. The public outrage was immediate, as people realized that their own security had been bought with a secret pact that ignored the most basic principles of law and accountability. The documents also revealed that the deal had been authorized at the highest levels of the French presidency, involving men who had stood before the cameras and pledged to find the murderers. The realization that the silence had been manufactured was a devastating blow to the reputation of the security services. The Rue des Rosiers case became a symbol of the dark pragmatism that often governs international relations at the expense of human life and justice. Since the revelation, there have been renewed efforts to extradite the primary suspects, who were eventually identified as living in Jordan and Norway. However, the legal hurdles remain significant, and the political will to finalize the process has been inconsistent. The suspects have lived their lives in the open, even appearing in television interviews to deny their involvement, while the French government continues to navigate the fallout of the 30-year-old secret. In the quiet, modern safety of 2026, the agency born from that smoke continues to watch the suitcases in the lobby. Knowing that the era of Swedish innocence was a luxury they could never afford to buy back, two of the primary suspects remain in Jordan, where they have avoided extradition due to a combination of legal delays and diplomatic complexities. The French courts have issued international arrest warrants, but the physical capture of the men remains a distant goal. The Chiesa Goldenberg restaurant closed its doors years ago, and the site is now a clothing store, though a small plaque on the wall remains to honor the victims. The plaque is often overlooked by the shoppers who crowd the Rue des Rosiers, unaware of the secret deal that defined the lives of those who fell there. The history of the street has been buried under layers of modern commerce and the passing of time, but for the families, the silence is still as loud as the explosion in 1982. The case remains open in the files of the Parisian police, a permanent reminder of a truth that was sold for a quiet night. The memory of Mark and the others who were in the restaurant that day is kept alive by a small group of activists who refuse to let the story fade into the background. Every August, they gather outside the former restaurant to read the names of the dead and to remind the government that a deal with a killer is never truly finished. They believe that as long as the suspects are free, the Rue des Rosiers is a crime scene that has never been cleared. On the late afternoon of May 20th, 1983, in the heart of Pretoria, South Africa, a 30-year-old clerk named Stefan walked toward his car parked on Church Street. The city was in the middle of the Friday rush, with thousands of office workers pouring out of the glass-faced buildings that lined the wide thoroughfare. Stefan checked his watch, noting it was almost 4:30, and adjusted his briefcase. He was looking forward to the quiet of the weekend. Stefan worked for a government department located just a few blocks from the Nedbank Square building, which housed the administrative headquarters of the South African Air Force. He lived a life of quiet routine, defined by the strict social orders of the time and the predictable patterns of his professional career. He enjoyed his morning coffee at a small cafe near the square, watching the military personnel in their blue uniforms march toward their offices. The atmosphere in Pretoria was one of rigid stability, though the political undercurrents of the country were becoming increasingly volatile. To Stefan, the conflict was something that happened in the border regions or the distant townships, far from the manicured lawns and concrete towers of the capital. He felt a sense of pride in the order of his city, believing that the strength of the state was a permanent shield against any form of disruption. He moved with ease. He often spent his lunch hours in the park nearby, sitting on a bench to watch the pigeons and the occasional military parade that would pass through the center of town. He appreciated the sharp lines of the architecture and the way the late afternoon sun would reflect off the windows of the skyscrapers. This Friday felt no different than any other, with the air cooling slightly as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The street was a sea of movement. He noticed a blue Alfa Romeo parked at the curb directly in front of the Nedbank building, its presence unremarkable among the hundreds of other vehicles lining the street. A few people were milling about near the car, checking their watches or adjusting their bags as they waited for buses or rides home. Stefan stepped off the curb to cross the street, his mind already drifting toward the dinner plans he had made with his wife for later that evening. The sidewalk was crowded with a diverse group of people, including Air Force officers finishing their shifts and civilians heading toward the shops. Stefan found himself walking just a few yards behind a young woman carrying a bouquet of flowers, her pace brisk as she navigated the flow of pedestrians. The sounds of the city, the humming of engines, and the distant chatter of voices created a familiar, steady rhythm that accompanied his walk toward the parking garage. As Stefan reached the middle of the block, the world around him suddenly buckled under the weight of a massive, white-hot pressure that felt like the sky itself had collapsed. The blue Alfa Romeo disintegrated into 1,000 jagged pieces of metal and glass, sending a shockwave through the canyon of buildings that shattered every window for 3 blocks. The sound was not a bang, but a deep, guttural roar that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of his bones. You are walking through a familiar crowd on a sunny afternoon when the ground beneath your feet suddenly turns into a liquid wave of heat and force. The air is replaced by a thick, suffocating wall of gray dust and the smell of burnt rubber, and you realize that the world you knew just a second ago has been completely erased. You find yourself reaching for a hand that is no longer there, as the screaming starts and the sky begins to rain glass. I have spent many nights thinking about how a single second can turn a crowded city street into a place that no longer obeys the laws of the living. It is a terrifying realization that we are all just guests in a space that can be reclaimed by violence without a moment's notice. We walk through these streets together, you and I, hoping that the rhythm of the day is enough to keep the shadows at bay, but sometimes the shadows are parked right at the curb. Stefan was thrown against a concrete pillar, his vision blurred by a fine mist of debris, and his ears ringing with a tone so high it felt like a needle in his brain. He tried to stand, but the air was so thick with dust and smoke that he could barely see his own hands. He looked toward where the Alfa Romeo had been, but the street was now a landscape of fire and twisted wreckage. The silence that followed the blast was more terrifying than the noise. The explosion had occurred 10 minutes before the intended time, catching the crowd at its densest point. 19 people lay dead on the asphalt, including military personnel and many civilians who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Over 200 others were wounded, their bodies peppered with the glass and metal shrapnel that had been packed into the vehicle. The heart of Pretoria was a scene of absolute, unmitigated carnage. Emergency services arrived within minutes, but the scale of the devastation was so large that the first responders were initially overwhelmed. They found victims scattered across the street and inside the ground floor shops, many of them in a state of profound shock. The investigators noted that the bomb had been exceptionally powerful, containing over 40 kilograms of explosives. It was the deadliest act of urban sabotage in the history of the country. The African National Congress, specifically its armed wing Umkhonto we Sizwe, soon claimed responsibility for the attack. They stated that the target was the Air Force headquarters and that the bombing was a response to a government raid on their offices in Mozambique earlier that year. The event marked a major shift in the conflict, as the ANC moved away from sabotaging infrastructure and toward hard targets that resulted in significant loss of life. The government responded with a massive crackdown, declaring a state of emergency and conducting raids across the country to find the cells responsible for the logistics. The investigators eventually identified the 2 men who had parked the car, but they had been killed in the blast when the timer malfunctioned and detonated the device prematurely. They were young men who had been trained in clandestine camps far from the streets of the capital. For years, the Church Street bombing remained a raw wound in the collective memory of the city, a symbol of the escalating violence that would define the final years of the apartheid era. The families of the victims struggled to find a sense of peace, as the political landscape of the country continued to shift and burn. The Nedbank building was eventually repaired, but the scars on the stone and the people who survived it remained visible for decades. During the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in the late 90s, the leaders of the ANC, including Abubakar Ismail, applied for amnesty for the attack. They argued that it was an act of war directed at a military target, despite the heavy civilian casualties. The commission eventually granted the amnesty, a decision that sparked intense debate about the nature of justice and the price of national healing in a country trying to move past its darkest chapters. I think the hardest part of any reconstruction is the fact that you can fix the walls and the windows, but you can never fix the air in the room. The people who walked down Church Street that day carried the sound of that blast with them for the rest of their lives, a ghost that lived in every car door that slammed too hard. It is a reminder that the consequences of a political decision are often paid in the blood of those who never asked to be part of the fight. 43 years after the blast, in the bustling, renamed traffic of 2026, the air near the old Air Force headquarters still carries a weight that no memorial or change of a street sign can ever fully lift. A small memorial stands near the site on Church Street, now renamed Helen Joseph Street, listing the names of all those who died in the blast. The area is once again a bustling center of commerce, but the older residents still lower their voices when they pass the spot where the blue Alfa Romeo once sat. The case is officially closed in the archives, but the echoes of the 1983 explosion still linger in the humid afternoon air. On the afternoon of July 8, 1982, in the small Iraqi town of Dujail, a 16-year-old boy named Jawad was perched in the high branches of a date palm. The air was thick with the sweet, heavy scent of ripening fruit and the dry heat of the desert summer. From his vantage point, he could see the main road cutting through the lush green groves that provided the town with its livelihood. The world felt ancient, slow, and safe. Jawad spent most of his days helping his father and brothers tend to the family's orchards, a tradition that stretched back through generations of his Shia family. He was a quiet boy who preferred the company of the trees to the noise of the town square, finding a rhythmic peace in the work of the harvest. He lived in a modest home where the walls were thick enough to keep out the midday sun, and the evening meals were filled with the laughter of his sisters. The town of Dujail was a tight-knit community of about 75,000 people, located just 50 miles north of Baghdad. It was a place where everyone knew each other's business, and the arrival of a stranger was always noted with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Jawad enjoyed the stability of his life, believing that as long as the water flowed through the irrigation canals and the palms bore fruit, the outside world could not touch them. He had a close friend named Ahmed who lived in the neighboring orchard, and the two boys often spent their evenings wandering the dusty paths between the groves. They would talk about their dreams of visiting the capital or finding work in the big oil refineries to the south. Ahmed was the more adventurous of the two, always looking for a way to push the boundaries of their small world. Jawad was content to stay exactly where he was. On this particular Thursday, the town was buzzing with a nervous energy because the president of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, was scheduled to pass through on his way to visit a nearby military installation. Jawad watched from his tree as the local security forces lined the road, their polished boots reflecting the harsh sunlight. He had never seen the president in person, only the giant portraits that hung in every government office and shop window in the region. The motorcade appeared in the distance, a long line of black Mercedes sedans moving slowly through the shimmering heat of the asphalt. Jawad leaned forward, his hands gripping the rough bark of the palm as he tried to catch a glimpse of the man who ruled his country with an iron fist. The air was silent except for the low hum of the engines and the rustle of the leaves in the light breeze. It was a moment of intense, concentrated anticipation. As the lead vehicle reached the thickest part of the palm groves, the silence was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic cracks of small arms fire coming from the trees. Jawad watched in horror as a group of men emerged from the shadows, their rifles spitting fire at the armored cars. The security detail responded instantly, the road dissolving into a chaotic blur of muzzle flashes, screaming tires, and the smell of burnt powder. The assassination attempt was over in seconds. Saddam Hussein emerged from the car uninjured, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury as he looked toward the groves where the shots had originated. He did not flee the scene. Instead, he stepped onto the road and began to address a group of local officials, his voice calm and terrifyingly steady. Jawad sat frozen in his tree, his heart hammering against his ribs, as he realized that the world he knew had just been irrevocably broken by a few minutes of violence. Within hours of the attack, the town of Dujail was completely sealed off by thousands of elite Republican Guard troops and secret police agents. They did not come to find the specific gunman. They came to punish the entire community for the perceived betrayal. Jawad watched from his window as the soldiers moved through the streets, kicking in doors and dragging men and boys into the backs of waiting trucks. The sounds of the town were replaced by the roar of heavy machinery. You are huddled in the corner of a dark room, listening to the sound of heavy boots on the gravel outside and the sharp, military commands of men who do not care who you are. You hear your father's voice rise in a brief, desperate plea before it is cut short by the dull thud of a rifle butt. You realize that your name, your history, and your innocence mean nothing in the face of a man who views an entire town as a single enemy to be crushed. The retribution was systematic and absolute, designed to serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider defying the regime. Over 600 people were rounded up and transported to the notorious Abu Ghraib prison, where they were subjected to months of brutal interrogation and torture. Among them were 148 men and boys, some as young as 13, who were singled out for a special kind of disappearance. Jawad never saw his father or brothers again. While the prisoners were being held in the capital, a fleet of bulldozers and tractors arrived in Dujail to complete the erasure of the town's identity. They moved through the date groves, systematically uprooting thousands of ancient trees and leveling the homes of those who had been arrested. The lush green landscape that Jawad had called home was turned into a barren, dusty wasteland within a matter of weeks. The livelihood of the survivors was physically destroyed. I have found that the most terrifying thing about absolute power is not the violence itself, but the meticulous way it keeps its own records. It is a strange kind of vanity to believe that you will never be held accountable for the blood on your hands, provided you write down the orders in a clean, official ledger. We often think of massacres as chaotic events, but in Dujail, the tragedy was managed with the cold efficiency of a business transaction until the end. The 148 victims were eventually brought before a secret revolutionary court, where they were given a trial that lasted only a few minutes. There were no lawyers, no evidence presented, and no opportunity for the accused to speak in their own defense. The judge, acting on direct orders from the presidency, sentenced all of them to death simultaneously. They were executed in groups and buried in unmarked graves in the middle of the desert. For over 20 years, the story of what happened in Dujail remained a closely guarded secret, known only to the survivors and the high-ranking officials who had orchestrated the massacre. Jawad, who had managed to hide during the initial raids, lived his life in the shadow of the tragedy, never knowing the true fate of his family. The town was rebuilt, but the date groves never fully recovered, and the soil remained stained by the memory of 1982. Everything changed in 2003, when the regime of Saddam Hussein collapsed and the mass graves of Iraq began to reveal their secrets. Investigators found the original documents from the Dujail case, including the death warrants signed by Saddam himself. These papers provided a direct, undeniable link between the president and the execution of the 148 victims. The paper trail he had carefully maintained became his own death sentence. During his trial in 2005, the Dujail massacre was chosen as the first case to be prosecuted because the evidence was so overwhelming and the crime so clearly defined. Saddam sat in the dock, often shouting at the judge and denying the legitimacy of the court, but he could not escape the signatures on the documents. The survivors of Dujail traveled to Baghdad to testify, their voices finally filling the silence that had lasted for over 2 decades. The testimony of the villagers painted a picture of a level of cruelty that stunned the international observers. They spoke of the destroyed orchards, the years of imprisonment, and the final, cold moments of their loved ones. For the first time, the man who had ordered the destruction of their lives was forced to listen to the consequences of his actions. The trial ended with a guilty verdict for crimes against humanity, specifically for the events that took place in Dujail. In the deep, desert silence of 2026, the palms in the grove are tall again, but the soil still holds the signatures of a man who thought his ledger was more powerful than the lives he erased under the sun. The town of Dujail has become a symbol of the long and painful journey toward justice in Iraq. A large memorial has been built at the site of the former groves, listing the names of the 148 victims whose lives were stolen because of a single afternoon in July. The date palms have been replanted, but the older residents say the fruit never tasted as sweet as it did before the bulldozers arrived in 1982. Saddam Hussein was executed in December 2006, with the Dujail case serving as the legal foundation for his sentence. The officials who carried out the orders, including the judge of the Revolutionary Court, were also held accountable in the years that followed. The files on Dujail are now part of a permanent museum in Baghdad, reminding future generations of the price of silence and the weight of a signature on a piece of paper. The memory of Jawad and his family is a reminder that the scale of a tragedy is best understood through the eyes of a single person watching from the branches of a tree. The world has moved on, and the political maps have been redrawn, but the earth in Dujail still holds the echo of the boots on the gravel. It is a story of a town that refused to be forgotten, even when the state tried to turn its history into dust and salt. On the morning of October 9, 1983, in the city of Yangon, Myanmar, a 45-year-old security officer named Min stood at the entrance of the Aung San Mausoleum. The air was heavy with tropical humidity, and the scent of jasmine from the formal wreaths drifted through the stone arches. Min adjusted his white gloves and smoothed the front of his dress uniform, checking the alignment of the red carpet one final time. The mausoleum was a sacred site, a place of silent white marble and sharp geometric lines that honored the fallen heroes of the nation. It sat on a hill overlooking the city, offering a panoramic view of the golden pagodas and the lush green canopy of the surrounding parks. Min felt a sense of immense responsibility, as the site was prepared to host a high-level delegation from South Korea, led by President Chun Doo-hwan. Min had worked in government security for over 20 years, finding a deep satisfaction in the precision and order of diplomatic events. He lived a quiet life in a small apartment near the river, spending his free time studying the history of his country and teaching his children the value of discipline. He was a man who believed that if every detail was managed correctly, the world would remain stable and safe for everyone involved. His morning had begun at 4 o'clock with a simple meal of rice and tea, shared with his wife while the rest of the city was still asleep. He enjoyed the quiet of the pre-dawn hours, finding it to be the best time to mentally rehearse the day's security protocols. He took great pride in his appearance, ensuring that every brass button on his jacket was polished to a high shine. To Min, his uniform was a symbol of his commitment to his country. The walk to the mausoleum was a familiar one, taking him past the ancient temples and the colonial-era buildings that defined the character of Yangon. He enjoyed the cool air of the morning, noting the way the sunlight began to hit the top of the Shwedagon Pagoda in the distance. He arrived at the site 2 hours early, ready to conduct a final sweep of the grounds with his team of officers. Everything appeared to be in its proper place. On this particular Sunday, the city felt unusually quiet, with the main roads cleared of traffic and the public kept far from the hill. Min noticed the South Korean cabinet members arriving in a series of black cars, their faces solemn as they took their positions under the main roof of the shrine. They were distinguished men, many of them ministers and advisors who had spent their careers building the economy of their own country. The South Korean delegation included the foreign minister, the minister of commerce, and the deputy prime minister, all of whom were key figures in the administration. They stood in a neat line according to their rank, exchanging quiet words of greeting while they waited for the official ceremony to begin. Min watched them from a short distance, admiring their composure and the professional way they handled the stifling heat of the morning. He watched as the South Korean ambassador's car pulled up to the base of the steps, a sleek vehicle that looked identical to the one assigned to the president. The ambassador stepped out, his posture upright and professional as he prepared to greet his colleagues. Min checked his watch, noting that the official ceremony was scheduled to begin in exactly 5 minutes. The silence of the hill was absolute, broken only by the chirping of birds. A few hundred yards away, hidden within the hollow spaces of the mausoleum's roof, 3 North Korean commandos sat in the darkness, their eyes fixed on a small electronic detonator. They had spent weeks in a safe house, studying the layout of the shrine and the timing of the South Korean motorcade. They were elite operatives, trained to operate with a cold-blooded efficiency that allowed no room for doubt or hesitation in their mission. The commandos had been delivered to the coast of Myanmar by a specialized naval vessel, moving inland under the cover of night to avoid detection by the local border guards. They carried with them several pounds of high-grade plastic explosives and a set of claymore mines, designed to create a lethal vertical blast. They had lived on minimal rations, focusing entirely on the technical requirements of the assassination they were ordered to carry out. They had planted the explosives directly above the spot where the president was expected to stand during the wreath-laying ceremony. They were waiting for a specific signal to trigger the blast, a signal that would be given by a bugle call meant to welcome the arrival of the head of state. They listened to the sounds of the crowd below, their fingers hovering over the switches as the ambassador's car reached the final checkpoint at the base of the hill. Back on the red carpet, a local bugler picked up his instrument and prepared to play the first notes of the welcoming salute. He had been told that the arrival of the ambassador's car was the cue to begin the music, a minor error in the protocol that would change the course of history. As the ambassador began to walk toward the waiting ministers, the bugler took a deep breath and let out a clear, resonant tone that echoed through the arches. You are standing perfectly still in a line of officials, your hands clasped behind your back as you listen to the first notes of a bugle call. You see the ambassador approaching and prepare to bow, expecting the president to be just seconds behind him. The air is warm and still, and you feel a sense of pride in the formality of the moment. Then, the ceiling above you suddenly turns into a wall of fire and falling stone as the world disappears. The explosion was a massive, concentrated vertical blast that tore through the reinforced concrete of the roof and sent thousands of steel ball bearings raining down on the men below. Min was thrown backward by the pressure, his vision obscured by a thick cloud of white dust and the smell of burnt powder. The sound was so loud that it seemed to vibrate through the earth, shaking the foundations of the hill itself and shattering the nearby windows. When the dust began to settle, the scene under the marble roof was one of absolute devastation. 17 high-ranking South Korean officials, including 4 cabinet ministers and the ambassador, had been killed instantly by the blast. 4 Myanmar officials also lay among the wreckage, their uniforms stained by the debris. The survivors were wandering through the smoke in a state of profound shock, their ears ringing with the absolute silence of the hill. Min managed to pull himself to his feet, his hands shaking as he tried to clear the dust from his eyes. He looked toward the spot where the ministers had been standing, but the marble floor was now covered in fragments of concrete and twisted metal. He began to move toward the center of the shrine, his training kicking in as he checked for survivors among the fallen. The scale of the loss was something he could not yet fully comprehend. President Chun Doo-hwan was not among the fallen. He was still in his car, over a mile away from the mausoleum. A sudden and unexpected traffic delay in the center of Yangon had slowed his motorcade by exactly 4 minutes. He had heard the blast from his vehicle and immediately ordered his security detail to turn around and head for the airport. The North Korean commandos had detonated their mines too early, fooled by the bugle call of the local soldier. The investigation by the Myanmar authorities was immediate and thorough, as the government was outraged by the violation of their national shrine and the death of their own citizens. They conducted a massive manhunt across the city, eventually cornering the 3 commandos near the river. 2 of the men were killed during a violent standoff with the police, while the third, a man named Kang Min-chol, was captured after a failed suicide attempt. Kang Min-chol was transported to a secure military hospital, where he was treated for injuries sustained from his own hand grenade. As soon as he was conscious, he was interrogated by a team of high-ranking intelligence officers. At first, he refused to speak, maintaining the silence of his training. However, as the evidence of the plot began to mount, he realized that he had been abandoned by his own government and began to provide a full confession. He revealed that the team had been sent by the highest levels of the North Korean military to eliminate the South Korean leadership and spark a revolution. He described how they had entered the country undercover as sailors and spent weeks preparing the explosives inside the safe house. The level of detail in his testimony was undeniable, leading Myanmar to immediately sever all diplomatic ties with North Korea and expel their entire embassy staff. In Seoul, the news of the bombing sent the city into a state of mourning and intense anger. The public gathered in the streets to honor the fallen ministers, many of whom were viewed as the architects of the nation's progress. The government put the military on high alert, and for several days it appeared that the peninsula was on the brink of another full-scale war. The international community watched with bated breath as the tension reached its peak. I have often wondered about the thin line between a historic tragedy and a complete global catastrophe. If that traffic light had stayed green for just a few seconds longer, the entire leadership of a nation would have been erased in a single moment, likely sparking a full-scale war. It is a chilling reminder that the fate of millions can sometimes rest on a single misplaced musical note or a crowded street in the humidity of a Sunday morning. The survivors of the blast carried the physical and emotional scars of that day for the rest of their lives. Many of them never returned to government service, finding the memories of the hill in Yangon to be too heavy to bear. The South Korean government established a permanent memorial in Seoul to honor the victims, ensuring that their contribution to the nation would never be forgotten. The names of the 17 officials are etched in black stone. By the time the records were sealed in 2026, the lone commando had already taken his secrets to an unmarked grave, leaving the mausoleum as a quiet, marble witness to a war that almost happened on a Sunday morning. The Aung Mausoleum has been fully restored, but the area where the blast occurred remains a place of quiet reflection for visiting South Korean officials. The structural repairs are seamless, but the historical record of the bombing is a permanent part of the site's identity. Security at the shrine is now among the tightest in the world, with multiple layers of electronic and human surveillance protecting every arch and pillar. Kang Min-chul spent the rest of his life in a Myanmar prison, becoming a man without a country as neither the North nor the South would officially claim him. He lived in a small, isolated cell, spending his days reading and gardening in a small patch of dirt provided by the guards. He died in 28, the last living witness to a plan that almost changed the world forever. His remains were buried in an unmarked grave, far from his home. The diplomatic relationship between Myanmar and North Korea was only partially restored decades later, but the trust that was broken on that October morning has never fully returned. The event remains a case study for intelligence agencies around the world in the dangers of state-sponsored terrorism and the importance of diplomatic security. The golden pagodas of Yangon still look down on the hill, but the silence of the marble is now a reminder. Every year on the anniversary of the bombing, a small ceremony is held at the site to honor the victims of the 1983 attack. The participants stand in silence under the same roof that once collapsed in a hail of steel and fire, remembering the men who came to pay their respects and never left the hill. The air is often as humid and heavy as it was that morning, a sensory connection to a moment that defined a generation. The memory of Min and the others who were present that day is a reminder that the world is often shaped by the things we fail to account for in our plans. A bugle call, a traffic light, and a single car out of place were the only things that stood between a quiet morning and the start of a war. We walk through these spaces with a sense of order, but the history of the mausoleum shows how quickly that order can be turned into dust. On the afternoon of September 14, 1982, at the Falangist Party headquarters in the Akrafia district of Beirut, 34-year-old Bachir Gemayel sat in a high-backed chair in a second-floor meeting room. He was the president-elect of Lebanon, a man who carried the weight of a shattered nation on his shoulders. The air in the room was warm, smelling of cedar wood and the salty breeze coming off the Mediterranean just a few miles away. Bachir was a man of intense charisma and military discipline, having risen through the ranks of the Christian militias during the years of the Lebanese Civil War. He lived a life of constant motion, moving between secret bunkers and public rallies with a security detail that was always on high alert. He believed that he was the only person capable of uniting the warring factions and finally pushing the foreign armies out of his homeland. He was a man driven by a singular vision. The headquarters was a sturdy stone building located in a middle-class neighborhood, serving as both a political hub and a symbol of the Falangist Party's power. Bachir enjoyed the energy of the meetings, finding a sense of purpose in the heated debates and the planning sessions that filled his days. He was surrounded by his closest advisors and friends, many of whom had fought alongside him in the streets of the city. He felt a deep sense of loyalty toward them. His day had begun with a series of phone calls to international leaders, followed by a visit to a local hospital to meet with wounded veterans. He took pride in his ability to connect with people from all walks of life, viewing himself as a leader for all Lebanese citizens, regardless of their religious or political background. He was a man who appreciated the history of his city, often speaking of a future where the ruins of Beirut would be replaced by glass towers and quiet parks. He had a young daughter and a wife who worried about his safety, but he often brushed off their concerns with a confident smile. He believed that his destiny was tied to the fate of Lebanon, and as long as he stayed focused on his mission, he would be protected. He enjoyed the simple pleasure of a shared cup of coffee with his family in the mornings, a brief moment of normalcy in a life otherwise defined by the sirens and the shellings of the war. On this particular Tuesday, the neighborhood was filled with the sound of merchants calling out to customers and the distant hum of generators keeping the lights on in the shops. Bachir arrived at the headquarters at 4 o'clock for a routine meeting with the party leadership. He walked through the main lobby, nodding to the guards and stopping briefly to exchange a few words with a staffer about the upcoming inauguration ceremony. Everything appeared to be in order. The meeting room was a large rectangular space with high ceilings and heavy drapes that muffled the noise from the street below. Bachir took his seat at the head of the table, opening his notebook and preparing to discuss the security arrangements for the new government. Around him, 40 of his most trusted colleagues settled into their chairs, their faces illuminated by the soft light of the afternoon sun. It was a gathering of the men who expected to run the country. One floor above the meeting room, in a small apartment that looked out over the courtyard, a man named Habib Shartouni sat quietly by a window. He was a member of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, a group that viewed Bachir Gemayel as a puppet of foreign interests and a threat to the stability of the region. He had been a regular visitor to the building for months, using his family's connections to gain access to the secure upper floors. He moved with a calm precision. Shartouni had spent the last several weeks smuggling over 200 kilograms of high-grade explosives into the apartment, hiding the bricks beneath the floorboards directly above the center of the meeting room. He had connected the charges to a sophisticated remote detonator, testing the frequency multiple times to ensure there would be no failure. He watched the motorcade arrive in the street below, waiting for the precise moment when the president-elect would take his seat. You are sitting in a room with your closest friends, discussing the future of your country, when the air around you suddenly turns into a solid wall of fire and falling stone. You hear a sound that is too loud to be heard, a vibration that feels like it is tearing the very thoughts from your mind. The floor beneath your feet disappears, and you find yourself falling into a darkness that smells of dust and old gunpowder. You realize that the man you trusted to lead you has vanished in the smoke. The explosion was so massive that it leveled the entire 3-story building, sending a pillar of gray dust high into the Beirut sky that could be seen from the hills outside the city. The shockwave shattered windows for several blocks and threw parked cars into the center of the street. For a few minutes, the Akrafia district was covered in an absolute, suffocating silence as the neighbors struggled to comprehend the scale of the destruction that had occurred in an instant. Rescue teams and party members arrived within minutes, digging through the hot rubble with their bare hands in a desperate search for survivors. They found several men who had been shielded by the heavy furniture, their faces masks of white dust and blood. However, as the hours passed and the sun began to set, there was no sign of the president-elect. The searchers worked under the glare of floodlights, refusing to stop even as the risk of a secondary collapse grew. It took over 6 hours of digging before the searchers finally reached the center of the former meeting room. They found Bachir Gemayel buried under several feet of concrete and twisted rebar, his body identified only by his wedding ring and the specific uniform he had been wearing that day. The news of his death was kept secret for several more hours as the government tried to prevent a total collapse of order in the streets. The hope of a new Lebanon had been buried. The investigation was immediate and brutal, as the Falangist militias conducted a series of raids across the city to find anyone who might have been involved in the plot. They eventually focused on Habib Shartouni, whose apartment was the epicenter of the blast. He was captured within days and provided a full confession, stating that he had acted to prevent the country from being sold to foreign powers. He showed no remorse for the 40 lives he had taken in the blast. The assassination of Bachir Gemayel was the spark that ignited a new and even more horrific chapter of the Civil War. 2 days later, his enraged followers entered the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, carrying out a massacre of civilians in an act of blind, vengeful fury. The cycle of blood that Bachir had hoped to end was instead accelerated by his death, leaving the nation in a state of chaos that would last for another decade. The dream of unity was gone. I have often felt that the most dangerous thing in a war zone is not the enemy you can see, but the man who lives in the apartment directly above you. We often build our headquarters and our homes out of stone, thinking they can protect us from the world outside, but we forget that the ceiling is just a floor for someone else. Bachir Gemayel spent his life fighting on the front lines, only to be taken down by a neighbor with a remote control and a grudge. Habib Shartouni was held in a Lebanese prison for several years, but he managed to escape during a chaotic raid in 1990. He is believed to be living in Syria under the protection of the government, where he is still viewed by some as a hero of the resistance. He has never been brought to justice for the bombing in Akrafie, and the warrant for his arrest remains one of the oldest active files in the archives of the Lebanese Internal Security Forces. Now, in the salt-heavy breeze of 2026, the killer's name remains on a warrant that travels across borders, while the statue in the park stands as a silent watchman over a dream that never quite woke up. The site of the former Falangist headquarters has been turned into a commemorative park with a large statue of Bachir Gemayel overlooking the neighborhood. The residents of Akrafie still gather there every September 14th to light candles and remember the man they believe could have saved their country. The surrounding buildings have been rebuilt, but the scars of the explosion are still visible in the memory of the elders who lived through that day. The legacy of the 1982 assassination is a permanent part of the political landscape of Lebanon, a reminder of the fragility of peace in a region defined by proxy wars and ancient rivalries. The Shartouni death sentence was reaffirmed in absentia as recently as 2017, but the physical capture of the man remains a diplomatic impossibility. The crater in Beirut has been filled with soil and stone, but the cycle of revenge remains a part of the air. The memory of the afternoon in September is a reminder that the history of a nation can be changed by a single person in a small apartment with enough explosives and a plan. We walk through these cities thinking the ground is solid, but the story of Bachir Gemayel shows how quickly the floor can fall away. The golden light of the Mediterranean still hits the statues in the park, but the silence of the marble is a reminder of the price of a dream that was cut short. At 4:30 in the afternoon on October 19th, 1983, inside the high stone walls of Fort Rupert overlooking the Caribbean Sea, 39-year-old Maurice Bishop stood with his back against a cold masonry wall. The humidity was thick, carrying the smell of salt spray and the faint, sweet scent of nutmeg from the surrounding hills of Grenada. He looked at the line of soldiers in front of him, men who had been his personal bodyguards just 24 hours earlier. Maurice Bishop was a man of immense physical presence and a voice that could command a crowd of thousands with a single sentence. He had led a bloodless revolution 4 years prior, promising to turn his small island nation into a paradise of education and equality. He lived a life of constant work, often seen in the villages talking to farmers or at the airport checking the progress of the new runway. He was deeply loved by the people who called him Brother Maurice. He lived in a modest house in the capital of Street Georges, where the doors were often left open for citizens to come and voice their concerns. He was a man who believed in the power of the community, finding his greatest joy in the large rallies where he could feel the energy of the public. He was a devoted father and a son who still checked on his mother every evening before returning to the duties of the state. He felt a profound connection to the soil of his island. His morning had begun under house arrest, a prisoner of his own deputy and lifelong friend, Bernard Cord, who believed Maurice was not radical enough for the future of the party. The air in the house was stagnant, the phone lines cut, and the windows guarded by soldiers with automatic rifles. Maurice spent the hours pacing the small living room, trying to understand how the men he had built a nation with could turn into his jailers in a single night. The silence was broken at noon by the sound of a distant roar that grew into a deafening chant as 30,000 people, nearly a third of the island's population, marched toward his house. They pushed past the guards, picked Maurice up on their shoulders, and carried him through the streets in a sea of celebration. He was their leader, and they had come to reclaim him. He felt a momentary surge of hope as the crowd moved toward the safety of the military fortress on the hill. The fort was a massive, 17th-century structure with thick walls and narrow passages that had seen centuries of colonial conflict. Maurice and his closest cabinet ministers, including the pregnant education minister Jacqueline Kreft, gathered in a central courtyard to plan their next move. They believed that the sheer size of the crowd would prevent the hardline military faction from taking any violent action. They felt that the sheer weight of the people's will was their armor. The atmosphere changed when 3 Soviet-built armored personnel carriers appeared at the gates of the fort. They did not stop for the crowd. Instead, they drove directly into the mass of people, their heavy tires crushing anyone who could not move fast enough. The soldiers on top opened fire with heavy machine guns, turning the celebration into a scene of absolute chaotic slaughter. Maurice watched from the balcony, his face a mask of horror as he saw his people falling. You are standing in a cramped courtyard, the air filled with the screams of thousands of people and the metallic, rhythmic thud of heavy machine guns. You look at the men you once shared meals with, men you promoted and trusted with your life, and you see them leveling their rifles at your chest. The fortress that was supposed to be your sanctuary has become a box with no exits. You realize that the revolution you started has finally come for its own creator. I have found that the most silent moment in history is not the absence of sound, but the second when a person realizes that their life is being ended by a friend. It is a betrayal that echoes louder than any gunshot, a total collapse of the world that leaves the victim standing in a vacuum. We often look for monsters in the shadows, but the story of Maurice Bishop shows us that the real danger is often sitting right next to us at the dinner table. The soldiers separated Maurice and 7 of his most loyal ministers from the crowd, leading them toward a quiet corner of the inner courtyard against a thick stone wall. There were no charges read and no final words allowed. The firing squad, led by a lieutenant who had been trained by Maurice's own government, took their positions and fired a series of rapid, rhythmic bursts. The Prime Minister of Grenada fell to the ground alongside the people who had stayed by his side until the end. The military council immediately declared a 4-day, shoot-on-sight curfew, effectively turning the entire island into a prison. The bodies of Maurice Bishop and his colleagues were taken away in the back of a truck, reportedly moved to a remote military camp, where they were burned in a pit of tires to hide the evidence of the execution. The man who had been the face of the island's future had been reduced to a secret that the new government tried to bury in the ash. The execution was the direct catalyst for the United States invasion of the island just 6 days later, an operation known as Urgent Fury. The American paratroopers found the island in a state of profound trauma, with the population hiding in their homes and the military council in total disarray. The intervention ended the coup, but it could not bring back the man who had come to represent the hope of a generation. The paradise had officially fallen into the dark. The subsequent trials of the Grenada 17, including Bernard Coard, revealed the depth of the internal paranoia that had led to the massacre. They were sentenced to death, though this was later commuted to life imprisonment. During the hearings, they described a world of secret meetings and ideological purity that had blinded them to the humanity of the man they had once called their brother. The courtroom was filled with the ghosts of 1983. Maurice Bishop's remains were never recovered, despite decades of searches and international forensic investigations. His disappearance remains a raw, open wound for the people of Grenada, who still gather at the fort every October to place flowers against the wall where he was last seen alive. The site has been renamed Fort George, and the scars of the bullets are still visible in the ancient masonry, a permanent record of the day the music stopped on the island. Even now, as the tide pulls at the Grenadian coast in 2026, the ground at the fort has not yet given up its final secret, leaving a nation to look at the horizon and wonder where their brother was finally laid to rest. The mystery of the missing remains continues to be a point of national discussion, with new theories occasionally surfacing about the location of the burial pit. Bernard Coard was released from prison several years ago and now lives in relative obscurity, having never provided a definitive answer as to where his former friend was laid to rest. The airport that Maurice Bishop dreamed of now bears his name, welcoming millions of visitors to an island that still remembers his voice. The story of the October afternoon is a reminder that the most dangerous walls are not the ones built of stone, but the ones we build between ourselves and the people we trust. Maurice Bishop led a revolution of the heart, only to be consumed by the cold mechanics of power. He left behind a nation that is still trying to find its way back to the light he once described. The waves still hit the walls of the fort, but the air in the courtyard remains heavy with the weight of what was lost. I hope these 12 stories have stayed with you tonight, like the embers of a fire that refused to go out. We have traveled from the gold vaults of Australia to the fortresses of the Caribbean, looking at the thin lines that separate our safety from the shadows. It is a strange, dark world out there, and I appreciate you sitting here with me to navigate through it. Turn the lights down, listen to the rain, and if you're still awake, maybe double-check the lock on your front door before you finally close your eyes.